Okay, so is the universe just a giant computer talking to itself? I know, it sounds straight out of science fiction, but what if I told you that the exact same foundational math governing a simple desktop computer also applies to human emotion, our perception of reality, and the very fabric of space-time itself? Welcome to this explainer. Today we are unpacking a truly fascinating paper titled Syntax of the Universal Automaton. We're going to be starting incredibly small, looking at the absolute basic rules of computer science, and then we're going to zoom all the way out to the bleeding edge of theoretical physics. It is going to be quite the ride. So here is our roadmap for today. 1. Machines that process language. 2. The rules of grammar. 3. Math and physics as languages. 4. The syntax of human thought. And finally, 5. Turning the universe outside in. Let's get right into section 1, machines that process language, how machines read the world. Okay, we're kicking things off at the absolute foundation of computation theory. We really need to look at the two basic types of automata, or machines that process language. We've got two heavyweights here, transducers and acceptors. Both of these are defined in mathematics by a 5-tuple. Now, I know 5-tuple sounds incredibly dense, but honestly, just think of it like a strict baking recipe. It's really just a formalized list of 5 ingredients, like an alphabet of symbols, internal states, and transition functions. The key difference is what they actually do with those ingredients. Transducers actually convert informational input into informational output by physically changing their internal states. They spit out a result. Acceptors, on the other hand, well, they just classify or recognize strings of symbols. They don't necessarily produce an output. They just sort of look at a string of data and say, yep, I recognize this, or nope, I don't. So demystifying all that heavy 5-tuple math really just leaves us with the simple concept of a machine taking inputs and changing its internal states to process the world around it.
Moving right along to section 2, the rules of grammar, giving structure to the machine. So how do these basics build into generative grammars, acting as a deductive process, leading us from highly general symbols all the way down to specific terminal configurations?
This setup is brilliant because it perfectly illustrates how those rules scale. Notice how the 4 levels of generative grammar build perfectly from the bottom up. At the very bottom, Type 3 regular languages only require a finite deterministic automata. That's just a basic machine with literally 0 memory. As we move up, the language gets more complex, right? It requires more memory and a way more sophisticated machine. At Type 2, we need a push-down automata with a fixed memory stack. Type 1 requires memory proportional to the word length. And finally, at the very top, Type 0 unrestricted languages require a universal Turing machine with completely unlimited memory. This is essentially the universal ladder of computation. Okay, section 3. Math and physics as languages, the descriptive nesting of reality. Now, this is where we make a massive pivot. We are moving entirely away from just talking about desktop computers, because according to the source material, physics and mathematics aren't just theories. They actually meet all the linguistic criteria to be considered literal languages. So the crucial point here is understanding the definition of syntax. Syntax isn't just about figuring out where to put a comma in a sentence. A syntax is a compilation of invariant spatial, meaning structural, and temporal, meaning grammatical, rules of a language. And here is the really profound takeaway. A syntax distributes over all expressions of a language. That means even the physical laws of our universe, like the concept of general covariance in physics, act as a syntax for the universe. The laws of physics are quite literally the grammar of reality. Let's see how this creates what the source calls descriptive nesting. Imagine a physical machine processing a string of input. It relies on layers of language, right? First, you have the input language itself. Second, the mutable programming, like machine code. Third, the actual hardwired architecture of the device. But it definitely doesn't stop there. The 4th level is the nomological language. Those are the literal laws of physics that allow the hardware to function in the first place. And finally, you have the 5th metaphysical level that maintains the laws of physics themselves. Every single language in this sequence is expressed in terms of the next one down. It forms this perfectly nested Russian doll of reality. To make this a bit more concrete, let's look at how mathematical theories are built exactly like spoken languages. A theoretical language has a signature. This signature, represented by the Greek letter sigma, contains non-logical constants, which are just your basic fundamental concepts like addition or geometry. Then you have variables and logical constants like the symbols for and or or. Because math uses recognizable strings of symbols to describe truths and relationships obeying strict syntactic rules, it is,
by definition, a language. Section 4. The syntax of human thought. Cognition as computation. Now let's expand this logic to the absolute most important observers in the scientific world, us. Let's look at the primary transducers of science, human beings, whose very perception and cognition are actually syntaxes themselves.
I know, that's an alphabet soup of acronyms, but stick with me, let's carefully unpack the Human Cognitive Perceptual Syntax, or HCS. Remember, we are transducers taking in the universe and creating an output. How do we do it? Well, through these 4 nested syntaxes. First, STOS, space-time-object syntax. This is how we logically organize basic spatial reality. Next, LMS, logico-mathematical syntax, which governs our rules of logic. Third, QPS, qualio-perceptual syntax. This is how we extract actual experience and meaning from our perception. And finally, and this is incredible, ETS, emotelic syntax. The text argues that even our nebulous human emotions and feelings are structured syntaxes used to determine utility in the real world. Your feelings are quite literally mathematical syntax. Mind-blowing, right? You know, communication isn't just about you talking to me externally. A universal machine, whether we're talking about a supercomputer or a human brain, is essentially a self-communication system. It's constantly relaying information among its own abstract components through operations like read, write, and relocate. In order to actualize language, a system basically has to talk to itself internally between its own parts. And that brings us to the climax, Section 5, turning the universe outside in, the conspansive duality. We've gone from basic machine memory all the way to the syntax of human emotion. So what happens when we take this self-communication concept and scale it up to the ultimate scale of the entire physical universe? Enter the concept of conspansive duality. The text defines this as a dual extensional relationship between the conventional geometric view of physics that we all learned in school and something called transductive algebra. Now, it's really important to note that this is a non-competitive upgrade. We aren't just throwing out classical physics, rather we are combining 2 distinct models of reality into one much more complete, totally staggering picture. Let's contrast these 2 models for a second. Classical physics reposes everything in space. Think of a giant grid where geometric concepts like vectors apply to fields outside the objects. Space basically contains the stuff. But transductive algebra applies a logical transformation that turns reality outside in. It creates what the author calls distributed subjectivization. In this model, objects consistently internalize their interactions. So instead of objects existing inside space, space and interactions are effectively internalized inside the objects. The vectors are now describing the internal syntactic states of the objects themselves. Which leads us to this absolute mic drop conclusion from the source text. In effect, the universe becomes a self-simulation running inside its own contents. By applying the exact same rules of language and automata that we started with, those simple transducers and acceptors, to the laws of physics, the entire universe basically operates just like a universal machine communicating with itself. It is literally a self-simulation computing its own reality. So that brings us to our final thought. We've just seen that human cognition and human emotion are literal syntaxes. They are part of the fundamental language of reality. So if the universe is indeed a self-simulation computing its own existence through an interconnected syntax, what role do your own thoughts and emotions play in its programming? Are we just reading the code, or are our internal states actively writing it? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.